all of you have been invited at the instance of PUCL Maharashtra, which is hosting this meeting. People thought, like Marx for that matter, thought when railways were being built in India, that time he thought that once the railways come, I was talking about Marx, but anybody for that matter, that when industrialization happens, because the railways came and the industrialization would happen in India, and because of that this kind of system that exists, and Marx called it the biggest obstacle in India's progress. Okay, and I termed that Marx was the first man who actually problematized caste. I did not get a reference that anybody before that has problematized caste. So let me, because there is a lot of thing goes around Marx, you know, the Marx has become an enemy of the anti-caste people, you know.
Big achievement of Ambedkar, one of the most scrutinized and valorized figures of the 20th century, he pulls off one great feat, which is in 1929, he drafts the first ever legislation against untouchability, and more specifically on the question of temple entry, because he realizes, you know, over a controversy that takes place in Bombay, not very far from where we are sitting, in a temple called Bhuleshwar Temple. Apparently it's a God Saraswat Brahmin temple. The trustees of that temple bring to the knowledge of Ambedkar that, look, we are progressive, we do want Dalits to enter our temples, but the problem is that in the year 1908, Privy Council ruled that trustees of a temple have to uphold whatever the custom of the temple has always been. You cannot change it at all. If you change it, then you are guilty of breach of trust. You are personally liable to all sorts of offenses, you know. So this has made it impossible for us to carry out this kind of a reform. So we need to overcome this judicial hurdle by bringing about legislation that will get around this problem. Now this was something which Ambedkar comes to know in 1929, because till then he also took the view that, look, it's just a matter of you are being open to this idea. Why can't they just have that right? Equal right. Then they said there is this problem. So he actually drafts a law specifically to overcome that Privy Council judgment, right? Now Gandhi did not, you know, the last time he ever dealt with legislative aspects was post Champaran, you know, in the context of that indigo workers' rights. He admits that that was the first time ever I dealt with it, and then after that I took this policy of non-cooperation. So there was no question of my bothering about what enactments you come out with, what policies you take. Ideally I wouldn't want Indians to attend your schools, colleges, universities, courts. We boycotting everything. So having taken that position, he was not engaging with it at all. But then post Pune Pact, he realizes that there is no way this temple entry problem can be overcome unless you deal with this Privy Council judgment. I mean, the realization that Ambedkar already had, but the difference is Ambedkar suggested in his draft law, which was introduced, by the way, in the central legislature by another man from this part of the country, that is M.R. Jaikar, or Barrister Jaikar as he's called. Now, he introduces it. Now, in spite of all that, because he never, you know, bothered to know what was happening in the legislative sphere, whatever debates were going on, Gandhi was still of the view that, you know, it's a matter of change of heart, through moral pressure, through soul force, we will be able to do that. Then he also was confronted with this reality that there is this judgment that was coming in the way. Now, by then he took the view that, okay, temple entry post Pune Pact, we have to make a reciprocal gesture, so we will allow, but not across the board, not as a matter of right. What we will do is, case by case, if in a given temple, so he actually carries out that experiment of his in the last quarter of 1932, that is immediately after Pune Pact, there is a referendum that was carried out in Guruvayur temple. among local devotees on the question whether they were open to Dalits being allowed to enter their temple. And it so happened that the Gandhians of that area worked very hard in preparing the ground for that, and apparently the vote that was a poll that was a referendum that was held by Congress party itself went in favor of opening up the temple. So he then says, this is the model that I want to be applied. This is the model that I want to be passed as a legislation. What should the legislation do? Not adopt a rights-based approach, not say that, okay, Dalits like other Hindus can enter temples.
What is the interrelationship between Gandhi, Ambedkar, and also the British colonial rulers on the question of caste? So that's the point. I will make a comment, and I like you also to respond if possible. So far as Gandhi is concerned, from the day of Hind Swaraj, his project was to mobilize Indians as a single bloc against the British colonial rule. And that's why he also went into Khilafat movement supported, which was taken as a very retrograde thing and which actually lost out in no time. As regards Muslims, Ambedkar was the leader of the depressed classes, the untouchables. For that he collaborated with the British colonial rulers. That's the second point. Gandhi's main enemy was the British colonial ruler. Now coming to the British colonial rulers, Marx have been mentioned here. Marx has actually written 2 pieces on British colonial rule. You must be knowing. One is British rule in India and future of British rule in India. Amazingly insightful in those days, even before 1857. He lost a bit, to my mind, he lost a bit of that incisiveness while reporting on the 1857 rebellion. He lost that sharpness. But the fact remains the British colonial rule brought in the modernity for whatever reasons, that brought in a host of things and all that thing. So Gandhi's, even otherwise, was a moderate by temperament, but as caste he never wanted that the Indian people should get divided on the issue of caste. That was his abiding priority, where Ambedkar was not concerned about that.
I'll just say a few words in reply to questions which were not necessarily addressed to me, but talking about Gandhi as someone who wanted to unite the whole, the whole people of India, and who was very generous in, even though he declared himself to be a Hindu and even a Sanatani Hindu, was very generous while looking at the Muslim population and the problem of Hindu-Muslim violence. He was equally blind to the hierarchies within Hinduism, because he was even more keen to preserve the unity of Hindus. And as a feminist also, in the women's movement we have seen the same kind of thing, that it is only later that we become sensitive, or when you talk about working class struggle and people who talk about class say that caste is divisive, or in the women's movement, there was a lot of opposition to talking about caste in the beginning because the problems of women are so widespread and universal and acute. But now I think we are in the stage where these questions have been asked again and again, and we do understand. I mean, somebody like Ram Punyani also points out always that whereas the present regime, for example, directs its hatred and its violence and impunity towards Muslims, the kind of violence against Dalits, there are two or three different kinds of violence. There's the daily violence against Dalit women, for example, or the daily violence of underpaying Dalits and undervaluing their work and undervaluing their persons because they are doing undervalued work. These daily forms of violence. And then when it breaks out, usually in response to some kind of an assertion. I mean, Kilven money, it's a assertion, it's a class assertion, but the whole overlapping of these categories means that the violence turns into a horrific form of caste violence, and it is much easier to dismiss the testimony of a Dalit survivor because in the same language that the British used to call Indians liars. So I think, this is the stories that Manoj tells. I think it is now the task of academics to look again and listen to more voices really. And he has gone into the details. And this whole thing of trying to, we do have to do it through the courts. We do have to do it through laws. In the women's movement also, we have tried to change laws. And the results are not always what we hope for or what we anticipate. But the battle has to go on in this way. And I think bringing out these details, not only the fact that, bringing out the names of people like MC Raja and, and, well, so many people that he has mentioned in his book. And so let us, not be telling, the saying that there is one narrative opposed to another, but now delving into deeper stories where we will find more heroes, men and women, who have done immense work at various times, not only in the courts. So this is largely about the courts, this book. And I welcome journalists who tell stories in their own way. Historians tell stories also, but they want to weave it into a broader narrative. So I think it is a task of all of us to pick up things from a work like this and build our own narratives which are a little more honest and a little more, looking at what is happening in this rapidly changing world that Anand talks about.